Welcome to the July 2017 Windows Server update for the Microsoft Australian OEM team. In this month's agenda, we'll be covering off two different technologies. First of all, focusing on Windows Server and some of the updates that were announced around the idea of continuous innovation with Windows Server. And this is something that starts following in alongside what we've seen with Windows as on the client and Office 365, where Microsoft is now aligning to regular aligned updates of these products so that you can go through and start planning appropriately for your customer deployments in the future. The second part of the piece that we want to talk about today is modern IT with Windows 10, especially with a focus on the Windows 10 autopilot capabilities that were just introduced. So these are things where new technologies, new capabilities being enabled so that when you're looking at organizations that really want to focus on still having their devices, having their Windows PCs, but really starting to look at ways of leveraging cloud-based deployment technologies to simplify that initial end user sign-up process. Then we'll finish up with a quick view on some of the upcoming events that the Microsoft Australia OEM team will be involved with, as well as some of the upcoming training programs that are taking place. And then we'll wrap up with some of the resources that are important for Australian OEM partners. So let's jump in first and take a look at Windows Server continuous innovation. So when we take a look here, what we're really starting to see is that there's innovation occurring all across Microsoft, and there's transformation across Microsoft as well as across the whole industry. So how do we start really being able to leverage those new capabilities, the new technologies, the new services, so that we as partner organizations can compete more effectively, as well as allowing our customers to really leverage those new technologies. So some of the important pieces here is being able to go through and deliver new value and features faster. So how can we go through and make sure that we've got the ability to make sure that new security features, simpler deployment messages, better options around management, for example, keep getting integrated. We also want to be able to integrate cloud capabilities directly into all products so that we can start enabling new scenarios. So even though we know that not everyone's ready to move all workloads to the cloud, or in some cases it might be almost everything, in some cases it might be almost nothing, but how do we leverage and simplify those hybrid scenarios to make sure that customers really are able to leverage the platform that really makes the most sense to them? We want to be able to provide flexibility so that organizations who need to keep running certain things for longer can keep doing that, as well as for those organizations that really want to be on the bleeding edge and adopting the latest technologies as they become available. And very, very important is making sure that new technologies evolve at the same rate that some of the different security, different types of security exposures, etc., start being made available. So how do we make sure that we can stay a step ahead of what's going on in the malware and the exploit world, for example, to make sure that customers have got the most secure environments that they possibly can have. So as we continue on with this, what we start seeing here is the semi-annual channel for Windows Server. So what we get here is the ability to go through now and start saying, look, we'll, like what we've seen with Windows and with the Office client, is it will be a continual process with ongoing development, and there'll be 2 feature releases twice per year. Now, before we go any further here, it's important to note that this doesn't mean that for those of you running Windows Server with a desktop experience enabled, that this is not something that's going to impact you right now. It's something that is really something that's being built around some of the other types of technologies, and we'll speak about these as we go through. But for organizations that do want to make sure that they're staying on top of the game, making sure that they're deploying new capabilities as soon as they become available, well, even to the point if they want to start getting access to them before they ship these features, this is how they'll be able to go through and start participating with Microsoft. So other important pieces here is making sure that things like application compatibility are great, so that we can keep moving forward as needed without you having to go through and constantly upgrade applications and rebuild applications to make sure they work in these new technologies. And then finally, when it comes to the servicing stack, we've got consistency with Windows 10. So, we know how to go through, roll out cumulative updates. We want to make sure that we provide the most stability and reliability for customers out there. So let's keep going and take a look at how this is going to be done. So looking at choose the best model for your workloads, What we're basically saying here is that for every server or every group of servers, and here we could be talking about physical or we could be talking about virtual, we can decide on the right model that really makes sense. So we can continue to consume Windows Server every 3 years as you have traditionally. So new versions of Windows come out, of Windows Server, new features, etc. get rolled in. But what we've also got now is the ability to start looking at the semi-annual approach for specific groups of servers. So the types of servers that we're talking about here generally aren't our general purpose servers. These are things that we might be thinking of as some type of application server. They might be cloud connected workload servers. But for pieces where we're really starting to look at new technologies such as containers, etc., and really rolling those out at the most advanced rate possible, that's where we need to start looking at some of these new approaches. So all up, how does this work? Well, what we've got here is the long-term servicing channel. So this is what we'll see. So a new release of Windows Server approximately every 2 to 3 years. We'll still offer things like the 5 years mainstream support, the 5 years of extended support, and for people who do really want that extended premium assurance, basically here we can say that we can give support for that for up to a 16-year period. Now with this new model, what we've got is that we're moving over to the semi-annual channel for certain technologies here. And what we get here is that every March and every September, Microsoft is planning on releasing new versions or updates to Windows Server, to Windows on the desktop, as well as Office. So an aligned launch approach, which means when it comes to planning, when it comes to deployment, when it comes to migrating customers, you can have timeframes where you can start scheduling things around, well, we know these are the things that are coming, so we can start working around them. So each of these releases will have two phases. The first phase, as we click through here, is the pilot phase. And during the pilot phase, this is where Microsoft will go through and get feedback. They'll make sure that things get stable during this phase. And then once everything goes through that pilot process and Microsoft is getting the thumbs up from customers, this is when they'll start switching that over and say, well, this is now the broadly available offering. Now, as you can see here, this will keep going on, and there'll be new releases of this coming out on a 6-month basis. So the support life cycle for each of these releases is 18 months, starting with day one of that pilot phase. So what it means is that usually as we go through this, there'll be recommendations that we'll talk about in terms of how long, you should stick on one of these builds, making sure that you're not trying to sort of jump too many versions at once, otherwise you may end up out of support. But we'll cover that as we go through the slides. But what you'll see here as we get towards the end of this slide is that, once we start locking in all these new capabilities, etc., then eventually we'll get to the point where this will be the next version of Windows Server. So the vNext / long-term servicing channel. So this will effectively mean that at some point down the path, that version, that build, those enhancements that have been rolled in will now be baked into the base product. So let's keep talking about those as we go through. So let's start off with Nano Server and Core Server. So these are the two products that Microsoft is introducing into the semi-annual channel. So note that just the full-on Windows Server with everything installed, including a GUI, is not listed here, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So with Nano Server, it will only be available through the semi-annual channel, which means that you are going to require software assurance when you do start looking at things like the semi-annual channel. So don't forget that you can go through within a 90-day purchase period of acquiring OEM server software. You can apply software assurance to that. Now with Nano Server, one of the changes that's occurred with this announcement as well is that now Microsoft is changing the approach for Nano Server, that it's really now going to be focusing on the infrastructure or the way that you go through and start running containers on top of Windows Server. Whereas if we take a look at some of the launch material, some of the information around containers was maybe running it as a DNS server, running it as an IIS server, for example. Whereas now that shift is really focusing, those kind of workloads where you want lighter overhead, they'll be just moving back over to server core and full GUI. But for Nano Server, really the focus here is going to be on those container images. Now, over on Server Core, what you'll see here is that we've got support for the long-term servicing channel and the semi-annual channel. So if someone wants to buy Windows Server through OEM and they don't want software assurance, they can take the version of Server Core that's included and keep running that until it reaches end of support, and then hopefully by then they've got, they're ready to move over to a new version of that. And with Server Core, this is where we can still deploy those traditional roles and features. So, domain controllers, DNS servers, IIS, other things that we need. We'll still have container image in here for traditional apps. And if we want to run containers, if we want to run Hyper-V on top of that, this is still going to be the perfect platform for that. So it's not going to be as lightweight as Nano Server, but it's definitely not going to be as heavy as Server with a desktop experience. Which brings us to the final piece of this slide. So this is where we can see that the server with desktop experience is only going to be available through the long-term servicing channel. So what this means is that whatever features get rolled into Windows Server at each major milestone, so each time there's a major new release or a VNext, so in the case of 2016, the feature set that's included is the feature set that full GUI version will keep as until it moves to that next major release cycle. So to use an example that we've got in here, things such as the inclusion of Internet Explorer but no Edge, for example, that's not something that they're planning on changing right now, because it's not something that was included with the original release. So Server with a desktop experience is important for apps that have got user interface dependencies. So especially when you start thinking about roles like remote desktop services, obviously, RDS without a desktop, probably not going to be overly useful to you. Now, as we move over and take a look at some of the other changes that are coming through, what's important to note here is that some of these just may not be applicable at all for what you're doing with your SMB customers. But let's just take a look at it just so you've got an understanding of what some of the focus areas are going to be over the coming continuous update releases that do become available. So importantly, the releases that are coming up are really about driving application innovation. So the focus of Nano Server really just becomes for running container images, and Server Core as a container as well as an infrastructure host. So making sure that you've got better flexibility, better density, better performance for existing applications, while you're still able to go through and start modernizing them. Now, the primary focus of the feature release is on application innovation, but there are some important updates to Server Core that will benefit customers looking for a true and consistent hybrid platform. So let's do a deep dive on some of these. So first up, now that we take a look, we've been looking at how people work with Nano Server, and what we really find is that Nano Server being used with container technologies was really the highest priority. And when it comes to containers, smaller is better. So for the 1709 release that will be available to people with software assurance, the focus is going to be on making sure that Nano Server is the best container image possible. So they're removing the infrastructure related roles functionality that's included, and what it means is that now the Nano Server images will shrink even further. So they're saying by at least 50%, so further decreasing startup times and improving the container density and performance. If you've seen any of our previous presentations or recordings on Nano Server, you've already seen that the disk footprint and the startup time are already way lower than what we get with Windows Server Core. So we're really talking about multiple scales of improvement over what we get with Windows Server with the GUI install. Now, Nano Server will be optimized for all the new application innovations in .NET Core 2.0. So basically, it's the cloud-focused implementation of the .NET Standard 2.0. So this solves the code sharing problem for .NET developers across the different platforms by bringing all the APIs together that they expect. So making sure that if people need access to those services for desktop applications, mobile apps and games, cloud services, that it will be available. Now, other things that have been added in here is flexibility for customers around the introduction of the container support for SMB shares. So customers can have an additional option for presenting shared storage for the container file system. So this way it's completely transparent for the container. And then finally, when we start talking about flexibility, what you also get here is the delivery of application innovations so that things like Linux containers and workloads will also be supported. So the Hyper-V isolation capabilities will be extended to Linux, so customers can add a level of security and isolation to both Linux and Windows containers. So customers will no longer have to deploy two separate container infrastructures to support both their .NET and their Linux-based applications. So just a final piece is that Microsoft's also investing in the Windows subsystem for Linux, which will allow developers to easily transfer their skills across. As we start taking a look at data center efficiency, some of the important things in here is that we've now got Server Core being the recommended deployment option for infrastructure workloads. Now, at launch of Server 2016, some of that messaging was also included with the Nano Server message, but as I've said, this is all now moving over to the or to the core or to the full version if you do need to have that full GUI experience. So what happens here now is that, with Server Core being the recommended deployment option for infrastructure workloads, it means that investments that are made to improve Azure, for example, are also now things that will also be able to roll down into the customer's data center because Azure is built on top of Windows Server technologies. So for the upcoming feature release, there will be a continued investment in security as that's one of the top priorities for customers. So some of the new capabilities being rolled in will be new network encryption capabilities so that customers can quickly encrypt network segments on their software-defined networking infrastructure as per their security and compliance needs. If you're one of the customers or if you've got customers who are running shielded VM environments, you're able to deploy the Host Guardian service as a shielded VM. So prior to this release was that you really need to deploy a 3-node physical cluster. So while that ensured that the Host Guardian service environment was not compromised by your administrators, which is what you're trying to avoid, in a lot of cases it ended up being a little bit too cost prohibitive. So that's why there's been an adjustment there. Now, another feature that's been requested is data deduplication support on top of REFS. So now customers who are adopting Storage Spaces Direct, which runs on top of REFS, can go through and extract even more value from their underlying storage hardware. So customers can gain up to 50% improvement in disk utilization, in addition to the other benefits that you start getting from using REFS. So speaking of getting on more value from the underlying hardware, you'll also start getting support for next-gen hardware such as Intel Optane for persistent memory, NVMe U.2, and SATA for reduced hyper-converged costs, as well as the new Intel and AMD specific hardware that will be supported here. And finally, so one of the other interesting new features in this release is the enhancement for the virtual machine load balancing, which improves the work that was started on Windows Server 2016 and is now OS and application aware. So this allows customers to not only ensure that the load is balanced between multiple hosts, but also ensure that application performance, which is pretty important, that important VMs stay closer, not move with priority, etc. Now, something else that's worth talking about is remote desktop services. So, ongoing support and enhancements for remote desktop services to make sure that it continues to get optimized and enhanced for those scenarios where it's needed. So moving on now, we've got the ability where you can go through, you can take a look at some of the documentation and links we've provided in the OEM blog site, for example, to take a look at where you can get preview builds. So you sign up for the Insiders program, which some of you may already be signed up for on the client side. Remember though that to access these new releases and to use them in production, that customers will need to have software assurance applied to their OEM platforms. And then finally, if you are a Microsoft partner and you're exercising your internal usage benefits with MSDN, for example, then you'll find that you can actually get access to these earlier versions and the updated versions through that platform so that you can stay on top of what's available. So to wrap up, and before we move into the modern IT with Windows 10 and Autopilot conversation, the important takeaway from these new releases that we're talking about is that as I said right at the beginning, these don't really have an impact right now on what you're doing with your typical OEM or system builder installation of Windows Server. So if you're installing a small number of servers, you're not installing Nano Server already, if you're installing the desktop experience, none of this really changes any of that. So you really won't see any changes on that front until we get to the point where we've got that new vNext, whatever the next major version of Windows Server is that gets released, that's when you'll start seeing those changes roll through. So let's shift gears now and we'll move over to modern IT with Windows 10. So first up, I just want to spend a minute talking about Windows Autopilot. And with Windows Autopilot, this is a way that the customer can work with the partner, the OEM, the distributor, so all pieces can sort of work with each other so that you can get the identifiers for PCs and effectively pre-enroll them into Azure Active Directory so that when the machine is turned on, the machine itself will already go through and fire up, provided it can get an internet connection, it will be able to identify itself to Azure Active Directory to let it know that it's this particular machine. Then Azure AD will be able to match, well, who's that machine associated to, or what organization. And that means that you'll start getting customizations appearing on the PC to let the user know that this is a corporate PC that they can enter their credentials and sign into. So once the user goes through and signs into this brand new PC, this means that, leveraging Azure Active Directory, Intune, or a third-party MDM service, the Autopilot service will go through and now start configuring the device for the user without IT ever having, touching the device or seeing the device. So the idea is that effectively we're just letting the user sign in with the initial release. The process is going to be just going through and using putting in the username and password, but moving forward, making it even simpler for users to go through and leverage other abilities to go through and do initial sign-ins to the device. Now, other things we can start doing is easy activation using the cloud. So if you're a customer, if you're selling CSP, so Windows 10, E3 or E5 subscriptions to users, then if they've only got Windows 10 Pro installed on these devices, well, you can use CSP versions of Windows to go through and do a step up from Windows 10 Pro to Windows 10 Enterprise when needed. And this is something that's very, very easy to do. So this is something that's currently rolling out, and we've included some links in some of the links that you would have found to get through to this video. So take a look at some of the details. There's some documentation on MSDN about what's required from the CSP side, but you'll start hearing a lot more about this over the coming month. Now let's go through and talk about some of the Windows 10 pieces, and when we start looking at being designed for modern IT, what that means. Well, if we think about traditional IT, we're talking about Active Directory, we're talking about domain join, we're talking about group policy. In larger environments, we might be talking about deploying System Center Configuration Manager, and we also might be talking about on-prem activation service for a customer looking at volume licensing. Once we move across to looking at how can we start doing some of these things through cloud technologies, well, what we can do is we can start using Azure Active Directory as the authentication. We can do Azure Active Directory to enroll the device. We can then have MDM policies pushed out through Intune and other solutions. And we can also do Azure Active Directory-based activation of user licenses. So we really start being able to go, well, for customers that don't want to invest in an ongoing manner in on-prem technologies, this is something where we can really start leveraging some of these cloud technologies. So if we go through and take a look at the IT lifecycle, if we take a look here at what's normally done here, we've got complexity at the beginning with the acquisition. So for deployment, there's wipe and reload. There might be additional tools that we use. There's a lot of PC-specific pieces we need to do. There are apps we need to deploy. We need to think about what updates need to get pushed out. And these are things that can have quite a few ongoing costs associated with them. Once we start looking at what this may be like as we move towards the future, and some of these pieces are in place now, but not all of them just yet, but being able to go through and easily streamline the rollout and deployment of new PCs. So we've got moving to user-based licensing and activation and management. Having zero-touch deployment, so IT don't need to do anything to set the device up, by touching the device itself. Instead, it's the user and their credentials that will go through and allow that personalized customization. So whether it's to the organization or whether it's to the individual. So we can start getting apps delivered in different ways. We can have the MDM solution push the apps down. We could have the apps delivered by the store if it's something that is available through the Windows Store. And then for updates, again, we can start leveraging some of the enhancements to the Windows optimization technologies here. And then finally, when it comes to support, what we can start doing is saying, well, if we want to leverage cloud technologies, we could enroll these with some of the technologies that Microsoft's got with the Windows analytics that are up on Operations Management Suite. And that's something that we'll cover in a lot more detail over the coming months, because one of the key focuses that we'll be looking at is how can we leverage cloud technologies in environments where we may still have on-prem technologies, where we may have a roaming workforce, and how can we tie that back in with the OEM message. So when we take a look at some of the important pieces here, what have we got here? Well, probably one of the important ones here is well, how do we start transitioning to the cloud via a hybrid mode? So let's take a look at how some organizations are approaching that today. So in this case, for a larger organization, they may basically have two distinct approaches. They may have Active Directory and Configuration Manager on-prem, but out in the cloud, they're just telling users to enroll the device with Intune against Azure Active Directory. Now, in the future, we may be moving to a world where everything, may be able to move to Intune, for example, in some organizations. But meanwhile, we do need something in the middle. We do need to have a configuration bridge that we can sort of have sitting between the two of these. So we might be able to get to the point where we can have 90%, but moving forward, one of the big pieces for Microsoft here is really making sure that they can do a great job of linking those cloud-based management capabilities alongside their internal management capabilities, so that it just becomes a much easier decision for everyone. Now, as we move on to the next piece of this story, what we want to focus on next is we'll talk about self-service capabilities. So if we were using Azure Active Directory Premium, and this is something where, stay tuned, we'll be making a few more announcements around some of these things for SMB customers shortly. How do we make it easier for people to do things like self-service password resets, do some self-service group management, application enrollment? These are things that you'll start seeing a lot more information that's very much targeting SMB as we move forward. And also, telemetry driven is very, very important, as I mentioned. So using the analytics capabilities of Azure to start giving us answers to things that we didn't even know were about to happen. So for self-service deployment, well, the self-service in this case, I've mentioned that we've got things like self-service password reset, etc. But even just as simple as self-service password via being able to sign in using your username and password when you first receive a PC. And that's your work credentials, something that IT hasn't touched. So it's a fantastic out-of-box experience. We don't have to worry about doing custom imaging. So the good old wipe and reload is something that we can start walking away from. And it also means that we can recycle or recover with ease. So if we want to be able to go through and reset PCs back to the initial state, this is really easy for us to do in a secure manner. For the cloud-based management, well, this is where we can start looking at how do we start integrating with the different cloud technologies. So some of the cloud technologies we might be talking about, integrating with Office 365. We might be talking about integrating with some of the components of enterprise mobility and security. But really, from the user perspective, it's that being identified based on who they are and the device they're using, and being able to manage the applications that they're working with. For the updates, well, making sure that we can go through and not just make sure that people are receiving updates, but that we can actually see how updates are being received and what level people are at. So if we take a look at just some of the things we can see inside the screen here, it's telling us that for where are people getting the updates from, we're getting a breakdown here. Now right now this is something that's sitting inside of Configuration Manager, but what you'll start seeing is that this type of functionality will be something that you can very easily consume through technologies in the cloud such as Operations Management Suite. So speaking of Operations Management Suite, we'll finish up the last technical piece of the presentation here with the idea of proactive insights. So with Operations Management Suite, what we can start doing is we can start getting advanced information. So before we do an upgrade, let's start loading the information we have about those PCs up into Azure automatically. So let it analyze the applications that are installed, the drivers, the firmware, and start letting us know things that it thinks are going to be problematic. Now, sometimes the problems might be as simple as this app needs to be running compatibility mode, or this app needs a fix applied, or this app might need to be updated to this particular version. Hopefully, most of what you're running will actually be that easy. But we can then also start seeing some of the ongoing device health. So we can watch for issues on the PC, we can start consolidating information across the organization. So if you think about your value as a partner moving forward and how you can start collecting this information on a client by client basis and going back to them and saying, look, this is what we're seeing. We think we need to take a look at this before it actually causes problems. And then other things we can do is, we can start feeding information in from other management tools that we're using as well. So if you want to start getting insights even further into what's going on with the PCs in the organization, OMS is a great tool to do that. And again, as I mentioned, this is something that we will focus on in more detail in an upcoming session. So let's wrap up now with some events and training information, as well as what's coming up, some of the resources that you need to be aware of. So first up, some of the events that we've committed to in the Australian OEM team over the coming months. There'll be a few of us over at Microsoft Inspire in Washington, DC. So if you're not familiar with the name Inspire, this used to be the Microsoft Worldwide Partner Conference, but it's been renamed as Inspire. So we get to go and spend a week in a very, very hot and more than likely humid Washington, DC very shortly. After that, we'll be participating with HP in one of their server roadshows. And at this stage, we'll be in 3 cities. We'll be in Adelaide, Perth, and Brisbane on the 10th, 15th, and 22nd. And there'll also be, and I just realized I didn't put the city in, but it's Sydney. The Microsoft Summit 2017, November 14 to 17, will be in Sydney at the Convention Centre at Darling Harbour. So, if you do make it along to any of these, make sure you reach out and let us know. The Australian training team for Microsoft hasn't published the full list of hasn't published the list of training events just yet. But one of the ones that I do know that is going to be happening very shortly is the EMS, or Enterprise Mobility and Security Training. So those of you who need to get up to speed around how do we start looking at that modern management of Windows 10. So how do we work with Intune? How do we work with Azure Active Directory, for example? These are things that are covered during the Enterprise Mobility and Training events. So these are 4-day training courses, and as more information becomes available, I'll make sure that we get information or updated information out to you. But in the meantime, keep an eye on that URL, add it to your favorites, subscribe to the feed, and keep an eye on what's happening there. Now let's go to the last slide, which is the resources slide. So don't forget, for any OEM and SMB focused information on Windows and Windows Server, that's where blogs.technet.com, also .microsoft.com as OEM team. We put a lot of information up there. We try to get blog posts up on relevant information on a very regular basis. We've also got the OEM Server pre-sales support alias here, so OEM Server AU. There are a couple of us who monitor that actively and try to make sure we can get answers through to you quite quickly, and that's on OEM pre-sales and pre-sales technical information. And then finally, Smart HQ, which is Microsoft Australia's central location to go to get information on Windows 10 devices, strategies for business growth, and it's got a strong focus on Windows 10, Office Server, as well as devices. So that brings us to the end of the July update. So thank you very much for joining us. And for those of you who are coming to some of the upcoming events, hopefully we'll see you there.